Hello, my name is Philipp Rudiger. I work for Anaconda, and I'll be taking you on a journey to Jupyter and back again. I'll be talking to you about seamless interoperability between ipywidgets and Bokeh 2.0. So let's start with the problem. There exists two separate communities, the Bokeh community, which is an interactive plotting library, but also affords the ability to build applications, and the panel library, which is built on top of Bokeh, which makes it easier to build larger applications, more complex applications, and dashboards. And so these two libraries work very well in Jupyter on their own and on the Bokeh server. However, as soon as you start to try to mix it with the ipywidgets or Voilà ecosystems, or generally the Jupyter ecosystem, you may run into trouble. So these are Jupyter and ipywidgets are thriving communities, and so are Bokeh. It's a Bokeh community, but really exists this gap. You can't use an interactive Bokeh component very easily inside Jupyter, except if you start a separate Bokeh server. Or you can't use it inside Voilà, because again, you don't want this Voilà server running and the Bokeh server. And in the other direction, you also can't use ipywidgets components inside Bokeh because it just doesn't know how to render it. And so that's why we set out to fix this problem. We wanted these two communities to work well together. If you want to build an application, a Bokeh application, you shouldn't then have to kind of rewrite a Jupyter ipywidgets component. And separately, if you just really like Bokeh, interactive plots in Bokeh, you want to do callbacks in Bokeh, you shouldn't have to then give up on that because Voilà doesn't support it, right? And so I set out to address this problem. I attended a Jupyter dashboarding workshop in Paris in 2019, and the Jupyter community was incredibly welcoming and helpful. And as part of that workshop, we worked out plans to do two things. We wanted to allow using Bokeh and panel components inside ipywidgets. So you take your Bokeh or panel component, you put it inside a ipywidgets layout, or you want to just deploy it using Voilà. That should just work. And similarly, using ipywidgets inside Bokeh or panel should also just work. There's a huge variety of different components contributed by the community, and it's a real shame if those aren't accessible. And so at this workshop, we started kind of birthing these ideas, but the real advance wasn't made until I did some initial prototyping, and then handed it over to Mateusz Perpraki, one of the core developers of Bokeh, who did really all the hard work. So I really got to give him credit here. He created the ipywidgets Bokeh library, which, as you can imagine, was relatively painful. You need to basically recreate a lot of the communication, the kernel infrastructure behind ipywidgets, or at least fake it, so that Bokeh and panel can talk to an ipywidgets rendered inside this Bokeh or panel app. So that was one part of it. And in the other direction, we created the Jupyter Bokeh package to allow using Bokeh or panel components inside ipywidgets. And we're going to discover how those two directions actually work in practice. So first, we're going to see, very simply, something which is being able to use ipywidgets inside a Bokeh app. So one thing I haven't told you, I think, so far, is that this entire presentation is built as a panel app and therefore as a Bokeh app. And so what you're seeing here is we've kind of defined these three ipywidgets widgets, created an ipywidgets hbox. Increase the screen size here a little bit. And now you can see here, we've rendered these inside this Bokeh or panel application. This just works. You can just put it inside a Bokeh application, and it renders, and it all works. We haven't actually hooked up any interactivity to these widgets, so that's the next step we're going to see now. Okay, so now you can use panel APIs or Bokeh APIs. In this particular case, we're going to be focusing on the panel API with an ipywidget. So for example, here we define a ipywidget in slider, and then we use this API called panel depends, which basically just says we depend on the value of this widget, and whenever that widget changes, we call this callback, and then we return a new thing. And in this case, what we're returning is just a little bit of text that tells us whether the value is negative or non-negative, right? And so we put that in a panel layout, here row. And we can see here when I drag this ipywidget slider, this panel component updates. So it all just works. You just drop it in your application and the interactivity works. And you can also go the other right direction and you can use ipywidgets APIs with panel, right? So here what we're going to do is we've created again two ipywidgets components, this ipywidgets label, this ipywidgets int slider. We've created a callback, which basically does the exact same thing we were just doing, which basically updates the value of this caption or label whenever the slider value changes. And we use the API that ipywidgets provides for this, which is observe. So whenever the value changes, this gets called and the label gets updated. We create a little layout for that. And you can see here, the interactivity also just works. So everything, we've now seen how we can use panel APIs, or we can use ipywidgets APIs, and you don't have to choose. You can just use what you're familiar with, and it all just works. The other nice thing about this is you can nest things in arbitrary ways, right? So here, we've kind of created a mix of a panel float slider, an ipywidget label, an ipywidget accordion. Inside that is another layout. Inside that is this float slider, this panel float slider. And again, we created a callback, which kind of updates whenever the slider changes. And so we've kind of had this crazy nesting of panel components, ipywidget components, a panel component, an ipywidget component, and it still just works. There's no crazy hackery that you have to do to make this kind of complex nesting happen. And so this is all really nice, but so far we've only seen actually core ipywidgets, right? And the whole selling point I was talking about earlier is that you've got this growing ecosystem of things in the ipywidget sphere, and we want to be able to use those, right? So here we've got an example which is building on a library called ipynpl, which is basically an interactive backend for the map.lib library. And we've created the slider, which basically creates a surface plot using the HoloViews library, and then render that using the map.lib renderer. And so what we get out is this interactive map.lib plot. I can resize it, for example. I can use all this nice interactivity here. I can save the plot. I can go back and forth plots. I could go home. But I also get the interactivity from this panel in HoloViews API, where when I change this slider, we update the surface plot, and it re-renders inside this ipynpl component. And so now we can kind of see where the power here really lies. We can mix and match these libraries from the both the Bokeh ecosystem, the panel ecosystem, the HoloViews or HoloViz ecosystem with these ipywidgets components, and it all just works. But again, we're not limited to just a subset of ipywidgets. Here, we're basically going to demonstrate we can just take this example from the ipyleaflet library. ipyleaflet is a really nice library for rendering geographic information on a map. And so here we've kind of overlaid a video on top of this map. And again, we render this inside this app, and it just works. But as you can see here, well, I've focused entirely on one direction. We've talked entirely about using ipywidgets inside this particular panel or Bokeh application, even if it's quite a complex one. But we also want to go back again, right? We want to go back to Jupyter and be able to use Bokeh components or interactive Bokeh components inside the Jupyter ecosystem, the ipywidgets ecosystem, with Voilà, for instance. So what we've done here is we've created this little app, Voilà app. And so if you're not familiar with Voilà, Voilà is a library for building dashboards from notebooks. Panel also does this. But the Voilà library basically just takes your notebook as it is. It renders even markdown text, which Panel, you can render it, but it doesn't take like a markdown cell, and it just renders it. So we can easily just take a notebook, render it without all the outputs, and get this interactive thing. But until the recent advances, until we created Jupyter Bokeh, we couldn't create interactive components, interactive Bokeh components. And so here we're going to be loading a few libraries. We've loaded basically Dask to load a data set of the New York taxi trips. We've loaded a library called HBplot, which builds on HoloViews, but renders using Bokeh. And then we've imported Panel. And so the first three steps here are we're going to load this data. We're going to create a point plot, which is just, we're going to plot the pickup locations from this New York taxi data set as a bunch of points. But we're also going to rasterize it. And so rasterizing, in this case, means we're going to use a library called Data Shader to turn these 15 million data points, which we couldn't just dump into your browser. We're going to render those to an image, which then, whenever we zoom or pan, gets updated. And this allows us to interactively interact with these 50 million data points very smoothly and interactively. So here, for example, I'm going to zoom in on Manhattan, and we can see here more information resolves as we zoom in. And this is huge. A huge thing what we've been working on for a long time, but until recently, until the Jupyter Bokeh library was created, this just wasn't possible inside Voilà. So you can now use this interactive component, which makes callbacks to Python whenever we zoom or pan to update the plot, and we can now use that inside this library, right? And so we're going to go back to our presentation. So that's really neat. We can now go both directions, right? We can go from an ipywidget, put it inside of our application, inside of our Bokeh application, inside of our panel application, and deploy that and have it just work. And we can take our Bokeh, interactive Bokeh plot, which makes callbacks into Python, which would ordinarily have required a Bokeh server, but we can now deploy that on Voilà, and it just works again. That's really nice. And at this point, I really need to thank a bunch of people. I need to thank Mateusz Pawraki, who, again, as I emphasized earlier, did all this work. He created these two libraries. He fought a lot with the Jupyter kernel to make that, to basically create a version, a stripped-down version that would run inside Bokeh. I got to thank Martin Bradels, who gave us a lot of the pointers that allowed us to actually make this happen. And I need to thank the Jupyter community for being so welcoming. I really love the workshops. I need to thank Bokeh developers in general for testing and helping out and just generally developing Bokeh. And I need to thank JupyterCon organizers and volunteers for what I hope to be a really exciting conference. I'm looking forward to all the talks. And I really got to emphasize, I'm really excited about the fact that we now have a marriage between all these different projects. They all work together, and the Jupyter community gained a new real member. Thanks very much. If you have any questions, I hope there will be a question session.